happening. By 1966, as there was beginning to be concern about the costs of the war, we were reaching a situation rather like elite opinion today about Iraq. It's too costly, we might not be able to win, and so on. Schlesinger wrote, I'm almost quoting, that we all pray that the hawks will be right in believing that more troops will allow us to win. And if they are right, we'll be praising the wisdom and statesmanship of the American government in winning a war in Vietnam after turning it into a land of ruin and wreck. So we'll be praising their wisdom and statesmanship. But it probably won't work. You can translate that into today's commentaries, which are called the doves. On the other hand, greatly to his credit, when the bombing of Iraq started, Schlesinger took the strongest position of anyone I've seen in condemnation of it. First day, it's so strong that it was almost never did appear in the press, but I haven't heard a word about it since. As the bombing began, he said, "This is a date which will live in infamy." And he recalled President Roosevelt's words at Pearl Harbor, a date that will live in infamy because the United States is following the path of the Japanese fascists. Pretty strong statement. And I think that sort of reflects a difference that you see in public attitudes, too. Opposition to aggression is far higher than it was in the 60s.
Howard Zinn, how did Vietnam end, the war end, and what are the parallels that you see today? Do you see parallels today?
Well, I suppose if you believed that Henry Kissinger deserved the Nobel Prize, you would think that the war ended because Henry Kissinger went to Paris and negotiated with the Vietnamese. But the war ended, I think, because finally, after that slow buildup of protest, I think the war ended because the protests in the United States reached a crescendo, which couldn't be ignored. And because the GIs coming home were turning against the war, and because soldiers in the field were, well, they were throwing grenades under the officers' tents, you know, the fragging phenomenon. I mean, there's a book called Soldiers in Revolt by a man named David Courtwright, and he details how much dissidence there was, how much opposition to the war there was among the soldiers in Vietnam, and how this was manifested in their behavior. And desertions, a huge number of desertions. And essentially the government of the United States found it impossible to continue the war. The ROTC chapters were closing down. In some ways it's similar to a situation now where the government in Iraq, the government is finding, our government is finding that we don't have enough soldiers to fight the war. So they're sending them back again and again. And where they're recruiting sergeants here in the United States, they're going to enormous lengths, you know, lying to young people about what will await them or what benefits they will get. The government is desperate to maintain the military force today in Iraq. And I think in Vietnam, this dissidence among the military and this inability to really carry on the war militarily was a crucial factor. Of course, along with the fact that we simply could not defeat the Vietnamese resistance. And resistance movements, and this is what we're finding out in Iraq today, resistance movements against a foreign aggressor, they will get very desperate. They will not give in. And the resistance movement in Vietnam would not surrender. And so the U.S. government found it obviously impossible to win without, yes, dropping nuclear bombs, destroying the country, and making it clear to the world that the United States was an outlaw nation, and impossible to hold the support of the people at home. And so, yes, we finally did what a number of us had been asking for many, many years, to withdraw from Vietnam. And the same arguments were made at that time. That is, when we called in 1967, well, I wrote a book in 1967 called Vietnam, The Logic of Withdrawal, and the reaction to that was, you know, we can't withdraw. It'll be terrible if we withdraw. You know, there'll be civil war if we withdraw. There'll be a bloodbath if we withdraw. And so we didn't withdraw, and the war went on, you know, for another, you know, 6 years, another 8 years, if you know, 6 years for the Americans to withdraw, 8 years totally. The war went on, and another 20,000 Americans were killed, another 1 million Vietnamese were killed, and when we finally withdrew, no, there was no bloodbath. I mean, it wasn't that everything was fine when we withdrew, and there were, you know, re-education camps set up, and Chinese people were driven out of Hanoi on boats, and so it wasn't. But the point is that there was no bloodbath. The bloodbath was what we were doing in Vietnam. Just as today when they say, oh, there will be civil war, there will be chaos if we withdraw from Iraq. There is civil war, there is chaos. And no one's pointing out what we have done to Iraq with 2 million people driven from their homes, and children in the dire straits, and no water, no food. And so the remembrance of Vietnam is important if we are going to make it clear that we must withdraw from Iraq and find another way, not for the United States, for some international group, preferably a group composed mostly of representatives of Arab nations, to come into Iraq and help mediate whatever strife there is among the various factions in Iraq. But certainly the absolute necessary first step in Iraq now is what we should have done in Vietnam in 1967, and that is simply get out as fast as ships and planes can carry us out.
We're going to break and come back to this discussion. Howard Zinn, historian, he'll be speaking in Faneuil Hall tonight at 7 o'clock in New York City, an historic site in Boston where we're broadcasting from in Boston, and he'll be launching a Power Governments Cannot Suppress. Noam Chomsky is our guest. We'll be back with him as well. His latest book is Failed States. Stay with us.
Rulers of the nations, as you fuss and fight over who owns this or that and who has the right to design, build, sell and store and fire all the bombs and guns to defend your holy empire. There are children hungry, children sick and dying. There are mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers crying. They're only pawns in your play of power and corruption. Slowly starve them, your new weapon of mass destruction. And prove to me, America, that you care. And prove to me, America, you're aware. Who's dying for your freedom in this land? Who pays the cost for the liberties you demand?
Sarah Thompson. Sarah Thompson singing Is It for Freedom? This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. My guests here in Boston as we broadcast from Massachusetts on this Patriots' Day are Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky, a professor of linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and Howard Zinn, a legendary historian, taught at Spelman for years till he was forced out because he took the side of the young women students, then went to to Boston University, and only recently in the last few years was